Chapter 23. Revisiting Philonous. What is mind? No matter. What is matter? Never mind. Bishop George Berkeley. Bishop George Berkeley, 1685 to 1753, creatively argued his idealist philosophy using a fictional dialogue between Philonous, from the Greek, lover of mind, and Hylas, Greek word for matter. The story was called The Three Dialogues. He wanted to answer the question he posed in his previous thesis, namely, do material objects exist? Of course, Berkeley would answer affirmatively in the colloquial sense. We perceive things around us. There are rocks, hills, and streams. But is there any substance to what we perceive? Berkeley would argue that what we see is what we get. So, it is essential to remember that neither Berkeley nor myself maintain a skepticism that posits nothing is knowable or that mental reality is somehow solipsistic. Nothing exists except your mind. There are things, but those things are fundamentally experiential in nature. Many philosophers dismiss idealism out of hand because they wrongly assume that it must lead to solipsism. Berkeley avoided skepticism by acknowledging that everyone knows they perceive things. We are aware of seeing, smelling, tasting, touching, and hearing objects without questioning those direct experiences. The underlying question is whether there exists something beyond the sensations we encounter. Is there an underlying substance? According to the materialist, a material substance is a thing in and of itself, the physical, posited as what lies behind the sensations we experience. On the other hand, Berkeley argued that knowledge is limited to the experiences of perception he called ideas. Everything else is labeled as notions, suspicions, or guesses. He also logically distinguished between concepts he labeled as material and mode. The material is the object itself, but the mode is how one perceives an object with color, heat, smell, touch, taste, etc. The mode is simply awareness of the properties of an object, and the material and modes must be different since one is the cause of the other. If there is a material substance behind what we perceive, it must be different. Otherwise, we logically infer an infinite regress. This idea is Berkeley's famous objection to material substance, reductio ad infinitum. According to Berkeley's argument, if a material substance supports a property, such as extension into space, but that property is identical to the substance itself, there would be no distinction between substance and property. However, for the materialist view to be correct, cause, substance, and effect, mode, cannot be ontologically the same. The cause must have prior cause. The substance is made of something else. The materialist worldview is one of atomistic regress. Chairs are made of atoms are made of quarks are made of fields must be made of something too. At some point, the cause of matter cannot be itself matter. We must come to something undivided and fundamental. This seems logical, but quantum mechanics took that deep dive and found mental constructs at the bottom, for example, information and mathematics. As the physicist and astronomer Arthur Eddington once quipped, the concept of substance has disappeared from fundamental physics. Berkeley also makes an argument that one could label the objection from parsimony. Take, for example, the object called apple. The apple has many perceived properties, including color, smell, touch, and extension in space-time. Remove each mode, and what are we left with? Nothing. So the question is, which is more parsimonious? The apple remains, but is unknowable, or is the apple gone? Applying Occam's razor, assuming an object is gone when one can no longer measure any properties, is more parsimonious, because no further assumption is required. Like the apple, the quantum field is subject to the same reasoning. Remove space, time, and energy modes from fields. Nothing is left. Using Berkeley's term of a notion, imagine a conceptual grid, or empty field, to which values could be applied. If we count dimensions as a property since they are integral to spacetime, We do not even have a conceptual grid, but for the sake of argument, we can assume that dimensions are not properties. Is an empty abstract grid a substance that supports field properties? Remember also, as we have pointed out, those field properties are defining characteristics mutually inclusive of one another. The answer is no, and physicists must acknowledge that fields have no substance. A field, or spatial temporal grid, is a mental construct. While the agnostic physicist might say a field is physical because of measurability, as we have seen, this is question-begging. Neither does the inherent nature of a grid necessitate any values given to it. After all, an empty field is conceivable. Physicists have no rationale for why, for example, particles must have the energy values they do, why fields have a minimal state called vacuum energy, nor why energy is quantized with rigid parameters. Any attempt to do so drives circular reasoning, as we have already pointed out. Therefore, the agnostic physicist will argue that these properties are merely a mathematical description of an underlying reality. In other words, math is just a metaphor for whatever independent substance lies beneath the modes. This is absurd, however, because it makes the ability to be measured, math, itself a property, which makes no sense. It is like saying, eyes are a property of color. If one chooses to be charitable, one might describe their regression. Our measurements are only measuring properties, but we do not know if they have any connection to the underlying reality. How, then, is it a property, or any different from Berkeley's distinction between idea and mode? Trying to dissociate reason from having any strong connection to reality, they hope to avoid the implication that the purely mathematical nature of objects points to organizing principles of the fundamental mind. One could question the agnostic physicist. Doesn't the fact that perception and information appear fundamental demonstrate evidence for an information giver? Does not a program require a programmer? No, says the physicist. Information is physical and organizes independently of the mind. Besides, math is our construction, so it only appears like reality is mental. If it only appears some way, aren't you saying you can't know anything about reality? My understanding is that math is the only way to understand the substance of reality at the deepest level. You don't understand quantum mechanics, the physicist replies, brushing aside the problem. Perhaps none of us do. Richard Feynman famously said, "If you think you understand quantum mechanics, then you don't." But of course, physics' complexity and esoteric nature should not be a hiding place from inconvenient conclusions, occasionally expressed as "shut up and calculate," something also attributed to Feynman. However, if alive today, I think George Berkeley would feel vindicated that science has furthered his idealist philosophy. One article I found about Berkeley and quantum mechanics states it nicely. As science writer Martin Gardner observed, in reviewing Stephen Hawking's A Brief History of Time, Berkeley would have been delighted by quantum mechanics, in which matter dissolves into mathematics and subatomic particles turn out to be quantized aspects of fields that are pure mathematical structures, made of nothing else. At the quantum level, Gardner wrote, "The word matter loses all meaning." I recently stumbled upon a blog article by Dr. David Ludden, a psychology professor at Georgia Gwinnett College. One of his students asked him why scientists are so close-minded about the possibility of God. His answer was the typical hubris. In the end, psychologists aren't close-minded when they come to the conclusion that supernatural entities such as an immortal soul or an omniscient deity do not exist. They're simply being intellectually honest, adjusting their beliefs to fit the facts. Astronomer Robert Jastrow described the methodical and arduous climb physicists have taken climbing the mountain of knowledge to the universe's origin, only to reach the peak and find theologians already there. Perhaps Dr. Ludden will join Bishop Berkeley and the rest of us there, once he can adjust his beliefs to fit the facts.